everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is going to be my August reading wrap up. And firstly, I cannot believe we're already in September now when I'm filming this, but I'm really happy about that because honestly September to December is just my favourite time of year. I'm one of your typical bookish girls. I love autumn, I love winter, just a good time to get cozy, read a book. So yeah, I'm not too sad about it being September, but at the same time I can't believe we're already here. But yeah, today's video is going to be a wrap up of all the books I read in August, kind of what my thoughts and feelings were about them. And first thing I will say is I completely failed on my TBR. So I think I read one or two from the TBR that I picked because I just wasn't feeling the vibes of most of the books that I picked. And I think it does kind of tie in with, as soon as it hits August, I'm kind of thinking of autumn reads, witchy reads, all those different type of reads that I'm wanting to read for the autumn season. And a lot of the books I had in my TBR were just a bit too summery and I just wasn't in the mood for them. So I didn't end up picking them up, but I did end up reading 10 books in total. A couple of those were rereads as well. We'll get into all the details. So without further ado, let's just get into the wrap up. So the first one I read this month is Blood Mercy by Phila Roth, and this was on my August TBR, so at least I got one check off that TBR list. And this one we follow our main protagonist Cassia, who is the bastard daughter of the king of this land. And within this land there's basically mortals like Cassia and her family, and Hesperines, who are essentially vampires within this world. Now basically at this point in the book, the Hesperines and the mortals had a pact hundreds of years ago to kind of broker peace between their kingdoms, but for some reason or another within those years that pact has fallen apart, and the Hesperines are actually travelling to this kingdom to try and get that pact or that treaty up and running again so that their people can have peace. The king has asked them to come so that they can try and broker peace again. Now because Cassia is the bastard daughter of this king, she isn't supposed to kind of appear at court or anything like that, but she actually ends up meeting in secret with Leo, who is one of the diplomats from the Hesperine side of things, so he is a vampire. They end up setting up these secret meetings to try and help push the peace talks along, and along the way there may be some romance in there, feelings start to develop, but they are actually trying to work together to find the best way to broker peace between their people. And there's a lot of twists and turns in here, a lot of darkness, a lot of political intrigue as well. And I think with Phila Roth, I really enjoyed her kind of take on vampires and the vampire lore. I really enjoyed the way she explored that, and I really enjoyed that there was a bit of political intrigue in here as well as a very strong romance plot. I do think that the plot will be kind of mainly focused on this romance going forward, but there's enough political intrigue in there to keep me kind of invested and involved in this one. I will say that in this one the writing is very classic style, so if you've ever read anything like GNR or Pride and Prejudice or anything like that, the style of writing and the style of speaking in this and the rhetoric in here is a very classical style, and that was a little bit jarring at first with a book in this kind of genre. It's not something I've really seen. I've seen kind of purple prose and flowery writing, but nothing quite so classical as the writing in this one, so it took a little bit of getting used to at the start. And the pacing in this is extremely slow as well, so again it kind of felt like a slog in the middle part. I think the start of the book had a lot of world building to do, a lot of setup to do, so it kind of felt like it was going a little bit faster, but that middle part did kind of feel like a slog for me. I felt like there wasn't really much going on. There was a lot of repetitive scenes and I felt like there could have been a lot that was cut out there. However, the second half of the book did really intrigue me. The way that it ended and the way that I think it has set up for book 2 has intrigued me quite a bit, but as I say, I landed on 3.5 for this one. It's not one that I'm kind of itching to pick up for the next book, so unsure on when I'll continue this series. It's definitely not going to be a priority for me in the near future, but I did enjoy the writing, I did enjoy the world building and the story, so definitely one I think I'll pick up, but I'll likely read it on Kindle Unlimited rather than picking up the books until I've read a few more of them to see if I'm really invested in this series, because at the minute it is a bit of a mid-series for me, so we'll see how that goes. But yeah, 3.5 for this one. The next two I'm going to speak about together because they were actually rereads and they're a series that I absolutely love, so shocker, I've given both of these 5 stars, but it's Throne of Glass and Crown of Midnight by Sarah J Maas. So these are the first 2 books in the Throne of Glass series, and I'm doing a reread with a couple of my friends on bookstagram. I'll put their pages down below, but we basically done a reread last year in anticipation of House of Flame and Shadow. We went through the whole back catalogue, read through the whole series to see if we could see any of the connections that people were talking about, and it was just such a fun experience that we've decided to kind of make it a yearly thing just for fun. Read through these books. We all really love the books and we love the stories, so decided to pick these up again for a kind of annual reread. In case you haven't heard of these books, so basically Throne of Glass starts off with Selin, who is in a slave encampment at the start of the book, and basically at the start of the story the Crown Crown Prince of Ardalan comes to visit Selena because he wants someone to fight in trials to become the king's assassin. So essentially Selena's background is as Ardalan's assassin, and she is in the slave encampment because of that, because of crimes that were brought against her as an assassin. And Dorian thinks that she would be the best person to compete as part of the trials to become the king's assassin as well. So the story kind of takes off from there. Selena is taken from the encampment to Ardalan to compete in the trials, and we follow her journey through that. And there's a lot that unfolds within this series, and it's very hard for me as someone who's read the series now coming up to 3 times to say too much without kind of spoiling anything. But just know that this one, it kind of starts out quite slow. I think the first 2 books are very much set up for background in terms of what happens within the series, and it really does expand beyond that. I think a lot of people kind of mistakenly call this romantasy, and for me personally, I wouldn't say that this is a romantasy series. I would say that this is a fantasy series with romance subplots. So I think the main kind of crux of this series is the world it's built, the politics and the magic systems, whereas the romance is definitely there. There's definitely a lot of romance within there, but for me it is more of a subplot than, say, if you read ACOTAR, it's much more in that romantasy strain for me. You know, it's definitely heavily romance led rather than this one, which I think is kind of led more by the story and the fantasy and the politics in there. So it is YA as well. I think it's the first few books are YA and then the last few books are a bit more new adult. I know that that's not technically a genre at the moment, but I do think they get a little bit more adult as you go on within the series. But yeah, I'd say if you've read ACOTAR and you didn't really like it, or if romantasy isn't your type of thing, then definitely try this series, because for me this is much more fantasy led. But yeah, I've read both of these this month. Absolutely love them again on reread. Every time I read them I see more of the foreshadowing that Sarah J Maas has put in there, more of the world building that I didn't notice before. And yeah, this is your sign to kind of read some of your favourite books, give them a reread, because you will notice a million things that you didn't notice the first time. And yeah, I think this year has been a year of rereads for me, and I'm definitely really enjoying it. But if you haven't checked out this series, this is your sign to do so. So the next book I read is The Unmaking of June Farrow by Adrienne Young, and this is one that was highly anticipated for me. So I read her book Spells for Forgetting last year around this time and absolutely loved the atmosphere that she built. I loved her writing style as well. Her books are usually quite short, but they're kind of magical realism, thriller, mystery, that kind of vibe. This one we follow June Farrow, who was left by her mother as a baby, abandoned, and has been brought up by her grandmother her whole life. When her grandmother passes away suddenly, she's left quite bereft, she's not sure what to do, and she's dealing with the grief at the start of this story. Now, with the Farrow women within this town, so it's set in quite a small town, there's rumours about them kind of going crazy at certain points in their lives, that most of the women are kind of cursed to go insane, and June feels that she's already been kind of getting hints of that within her life. She's having memories of things that she's not familiar with, she's blacking out, and she's seeing a red door every now and again, and she's just getting this urge to kind of go through it. So that's kind of where the story starts, and it goes from there. I'd say for this one, read it if you like magical realism, immersive storytelling, atmospheric kind of cozy thrillers, small town settings, heartbreak and love and tension. It had it all in there, and I have to say I really did enjoy it. I did end up on 4 stars for this one, and the reason being that I did think that some of the reveals and the twists were quite predictable. I had predicted them by about the 50% mark in this one, but it didn't quite take away from my enjoyment so much that I couldn't read the rest of it, or you know, it was unbearable to read the rest of it, because I knew where it was going, because I still really loved the writing style. I still really loved kind of the setting and the atmosphere that was built in here, but I did kind of guess exactly where the story was going, some of the twists that were in there as well, quite early on within the book. So if you're a big mystery thriller reader, you probably will guess some of the reveals in here, because I'm not a big thriller reader and I kind of guessed it. So I'd imagine anyone who reads anything like that normally will kind of guess these quite quickly. But for me, Adrienne Young's writing is just beautiful enough to kind of keep going with that story. It keeps you immersed in the story. It's really atmospheric, and yeah, really enjoyed this one. Definitely glad I read it, and I ended up on 4 stars for it. So the next one I read was one of my most anticipated reads this year, and you've probably heard me speak about this one. You've probably heard me speak about the prequel series, or not the prequel series, the series that was set before this one, and that was Air by Sabaa Tahir. So I managed to get my hands on an ARC for this one, and it literally made my year. I was so happy when I got the ARC for it, because waiting until October was painful. But now that I've read it, now that I know I have to wait for book 2, I'm in pain again. But it was so worth it. It was really worth reading this one. So in case you can't tell by my enthusiasm, I definitely gave this one 5 stars. stars. So as I say, it's connected with Sabaa Tahir's previous series, An Ember in the Ashes. So in An Ember in the Ashes, we follow Leia, who is a scholar within this land, and essentially they are quite downtrodden, they're quite poor, and the conditions that they live in are usually quite poor as well. And at the start of the story, her brother is actually arrested for being part of a rebel group, and he is rebelling against what is called the Martial Empire. So essentially this is the establishment who are in control of this land, and within that empire they have an academy which is set up for people from the Martial Empire to become masks, and within that empire we have Elias. So Leia actually ends up going to try and save her brother from the prison within the Martial Empire and comes across Elias within that time. Now Elias is actually the son of the main commander within this establishment as well, so his future is kind of mapped out for him. It's planned that he will become the new Marshal as well, but his morals and his viewpoints don't really align with that of the Martial Empire, so he's quite conflicted when he comes across Leia, but they end up becoming reluctant allies, and the story kind of goes from there, and it really expands from there as well. So in terms of this new book, it's actually set 20 years after the end of An Ember in the Ashes, so I can't really tell you some of the synopsis for this because it will give some spoilers for what happens within that, but basically this one follows 3 different people. So a tracker, a crown prince, an orphan who is basically from quite a derelict part of the land, and essentially it follows their 3 stories coming together. There's been a spate of murders going on within this land, and they're basically trying to figure out how this has happened and why this has happened. And I think while a lot of people have said that you can read this separately from An Ember in the Ashes and you don't need to read that series before reading this one, I would highly recommend that you do, because I think there's a lot of the context that is assumed. I think Sabaa does a really good job of trying to give you that context without it being info dumpy, you know, from a 4-book series. She does try and give you a little bit of context if you wanted to jump straight into this one, but I would definitely say that if you want to get the most out of this book, read An Ember in the Ashes, because there may be some characters that show up within this series that the impact of it just makes so much more sense if you've read that series. So yes, you can technically read it without reading that series, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would definitely recommend reading An Ember in the Ashes series first and then jumping into her after that. I think this one you'll love it if you like fast-paced plots, complex world building, intriguing politics, slow burn romance that's going to have you kicking your feet, found family. There's also fake dating in here as well, and just to be pre-warned, this is the type of book where Sabaa will take your heart out, stomp on it, kick it about a bit, stomp on it again, and yeah, no bars are hold within this one, but it's definitely so worth the read. I think Sabaa Tahir's writing is just one of those rare writing styles that just really gets me, as I say, so immersed within the writing that I don't even feel like I'm reading. I just cannot wait to get back within that world. It's really enchanting, it's really emotive, it, you know, evokes every emotion that you can think of throughout the reading of it. And yeah, I mean, you can obviously tell I'm quite biased. She's one of my auto-buy authors. I absolutely adore her work, so maybe it is a bit of a biased opinion, but if you haven't read An Ember in the Ashes, definitely read it, and then read Air after, and I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Next up, I read Song of Sorrows and Faith by L.J. Andrews, and this is the last book in the Broken Kingdom series, so I wanted to finish out that series before I jump into The Ever King, which is kind of a spin-off series from that one, and I did enjoy it. So this one is kind of a Phantom of the Opera retelling. It's bringing together all of the threads that were woven throughout that whole series and kind of connecting a lot of the dots of how they started at point 1 and how they've ended up to get here, and I think because of that the enjoyment of it wasn't as good as some of the other books. So in terms of the plot, it was a lot of just here's all of the reasons that these things happened within these last 8 books, and I think it was almost info dumpy in some ways to kind of give those explanations for how things happened and how they came to be. I think also with this one the romance felt a little bit lackluster for me compared to the other romances that I'd read of in this series. A lot of the other couples had maybe 1 or 2 books to kind of develop that romance, so you were really invested in it and you really believed the romance between them. But with this one, you know, you had 1 book and I think it was by like 30% they were fully invested in each other, and for me it just wasn't as believable as the other romances that she has written. So yeah, I think it was still an enjoyable book. I do really enjoy the world and the characters, but for me it fell a little bit flat. It was around a 3 to 3.5 for me, but I would still say that the rest of the series is definitely worth investing your time in. I think on average the rest of the books were around a 4 star, so I'd say the series overall is probably a 4-star series for me. It's really enjoyable. If you like romantasy, it's a really fun one to read. I think it's a really immersive read. There's 9 books in the series, so you can can really sink your teeth into them, and it has all of those tropes that we love within a romantasy series. So if you're looking for something that's fun and easy to read, these are definitely good ones there, because they do have that romance, but I think there's enough political intrigue to keep you interested if romance isn't kind of your main genre as well. But yeah, last book in the series, 3.5. So now that I've read that, I'll be able to move on to the Ever King, because it did actually give quite a good bit of context for that book. So I'm really glad I read that series first, because I think it will make the Ever King a bit more enjoyable for me. So next up, I read The Throne of Broken Gods by Amber V. Nicole, and this is book number 2 in the Gods and Monsters series. And I read Book of Azrael, which is the first book, probably around June last year, and the plan was to kind of jump into this one straight away, and unfortunately it just got pushed by the wayside and I didn't end up getting to it last year. But one thing I will say about this one is at the start of the book there is kind of a really nice device that Amber V. Nicole has used to almost give you a recap on what happened in book 1. So I was anticipating that I may have to reread the Book of Azrael, because it was quite an intense world building book and there was a lot of information that we got there. So I was a little bit concerned I was going to jump into this and not have a clue what was going on and forget all the details. But as I say, there is kind of a 2 or 3 page recap within this. It's done almost as a letter from the main character to herself, or just kind of telling you what happened in the previous story, giving you all the main details so that you're able to jump back into that. So I for one petition for all fantasy books to have that, because even if I've just read it a week ago, sometimes I can forget the details. So I was definitely appreciative of that. But if you haven't heard of this series, the Book of Azrael basically starts out with our main character Diana, who is almost like a demon within this world. She has been kind of changed by a demon called Caden, who is quite evil, tyrannical, and is basically held her on a leash for years because he is protecting her dying sister, and kind of uses that as bait to keep her in control. So Diana in this is actually kind of the villain. So we have an FMC who is kind of the villain within the story, which is a really interesting take. Now, one of the jobs that Caden sends her on is to find an old artifact. So she's trying to find the Book of Azrael, and along the way she comes across Samkael, who is a god from a land that no longer exists. And as part of the journey in trying to find this, she comes across him and his team, and they kind of reluctantly start to work together. Because she's a demon, they should kind of be enemies, but they start to work together reluctantly because they know it will be mutually beneficial to try and find this artifact, as they will both be able to get to use it. Obviously along the way there is some feelings that develop there, but the end of book 1 did end on quite a big cliffhanger, and this is quite a slow burn as well. So at the start of this book we are kind of dealing with the aftermath of what happened in book 1. There's a lot of trauma and grief for our FMC to kind of get through, and at the start of the book it did kind of feel a little bit lengthy. So there was a lot of filler within here and a lot of repetitiveness to kind of hit home that point of grief, how it can affect people. I do love the way that Amber V. Nicole has kind of used some metaphors within here to kind of show how grief can consume someone and how it can kind of embody them in their rage going forward as a human. But the way that it was done in here was quite imaginative, and yeah, I just really like the way she explored that. But I do think it was a little bit repetitive. I think it went on for around the first 40% again of this book, and we maybe could have cut that down a little bit. But as I read on, I definitely think that this book solidified my love for the characters in here. There's a lot of found family aspects in here. It really expanded the world as well. So definitely really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed how it was expanded in the story and how it went along. And the way that this one ends, again, it ended on a cliffhanger. So definitely looking forward to jumping into book 3 as soon as possible. Another thing I loved about this was it was multiple POV. So we got points of view from basically all of the characters in here. There's quite a host of characters that we're following, and in the first book they were introduced, but we definitely didn't get to know them as much as I would have liked. But this book definitely made us connect with them a lot more, so it just gave us a much more vested interest in them and what they were doing and kind of their importance within the group, and again solidified that found family aspect that she has in here. But overall I ended up on 4 stars for this one, again just because the start of it was a little bit slow. I do think it could do with a little bit of editing down. There was a few scenes in there that maybe for me just personally weren't necessary, but I still really enjoyed it. Really like the writing style that she has, and I'm not a huge urban fantasy fan even though this is urban fantasy, but I really love the way that she writes this. I think if you like anything like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or anything like those kind of 2000s fantasy series or anything like that, you'll probably like this, because I think a lot of the humour and a lot of the rhetoric is quite reminiscent of that in this one. But yeah, ended up on 4 stars for this one. So the next one I finished is Wisteria by Adeline Grace, and this is the 3rd in the Belladonna series. So if you haven't read that series, basically the first book follows our main character Signa, who has been orphaned from she was a very young child. She is kind of passed around all of her family as she needs someone to take care of her, but for some reason a lot of her family end up becoming to fatal ends, and she ends up coming to her family, the Hawthorns, who are in Thorn Grove. Now when she gets there, the family are kind of quite eccentric. They're throwing parties all the time, but the mother of that family has recently died. died. So this is quite bizarre for Signa. She's not really understanding kind of why they're doing this. But along the way, the ghost of the mother of the family actually comes to Signa and tells her that someone within the house actually killed her. So it kind of kicks off this murder mystery within the story. She's trying to figure out what happened. And she also has Death. So Death is the embodiment of someone within this, helping her to solve this mystery. And alongside her, Death has always been a big part of her life, and he is actually embodied and helping her along the way with that mystery. So that's the first book, and we kind of really explore that going through the first and second book. And then in the second book we have the main characters of this one, so Blythe, and Blythe is Signa's cousin, and we're kind of following her story along in this one and her romance within this one as well. So I can't give you too much of the synopsis because it does give a little bit of spoilers on what happens in book 1 and 2, but just know with this one it's definitely for anyone who loves Beauty and the Beast, anyone who loves true enemies to lovers. So there's going to be a lot of angst in this one. If you love gothic kind of themes, if you liked Stephanie Garber's Caraval and Once Upon a Broken Heart but you'd like it to be a little bit darker and a little bit more gothic, and I think you'll really like this one. It's very whimsical. I think Adeline Grace's writing is very immersive, it's very whimsical, it keeps you reading. You know, I think she's one of those writers that really keeps you on the edge of your seat at the end of the chapters. You know, you just want to read on. And for me, this was definitely a page turner. So I ended up giving this one 5 stars. I absolutely love Adeline Grace's writing. I just think it was the perfect book and the perfect conclusion for this series. So yeah, if you haven't read this one yet, and if you haven't read this series yet, I definitely recommend this for around the autumn time. It's very gothic vibes. It's got a lot of whimsy in there. It's almost like fairy tale-esque, but a dark fairy tale. If you're into that kind of thing, I definitely suggest picking this one up. I've really loved the series so far. I'd probably say it's a 5-star series for me. I've loved all of the books within the series. So yeah, highly recommend picking these ones up. And then the next book I read is Born of Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Now this one is the 4th book in the prequel series to From Blood and Ash. So From Blood and Ash I believe has 4 or 5 books out at the moment, and there's 4 books within this series. So very difficult to give you a synopsis for this book. But in terms of enjoyment, I definitely really enjoyed this one. This book follows off from the 3rd book where the character went through a lot of trauma. She had a lot of things happen to her. So similar to Throne of Broken Gods, I think there was a lot of exploration of the grief within here as well, and kind of how the FMC was handling that. But again, similarly to Throne of Broken Gods, I think the first maybe 30 to 40% of this was quite repetitive in exploring that. I do think that it's an important topic to look up, but I do think that it was almost too much within the book of exploring it. And again, for the first 40%, it was kind of nothing was really happening. There was no plot progression within the book, and this is quite a plot heavy series. So for me, when 40% of the book hasn't progressed the plot along at all, it does kind of stammer my enjoyment of it. And I do think that this one was a lot more spicy than some of the other books. JLA is a spicy writer, you know, she does write a lot of spice within her series, but generally I don't find it that distracting, or it doesn't take away from my enjoyment, because I'm not someone who likes it just for, you know, spice's sake. I don't mind it within a story, certainly not, but for me it has to kind of fit in with the context of the story, and it has to be, you know, within a story that has enough going for it, that it's not just kind of random spice scenes within the story. And I do think for the first 40% of this there was just a lot of that, or it was just thrown in, maybe because we didn't get that within the 3rd book and maybe other readers were looking for that, but for me it just kind of took me out of the story a little bit. I find I was skimming quite a lot because it was, you know, we literally had a scene 2 pages ago. Do we really need another scene? That might be for some people. It's definitely a personal preference thing for me, but just because the plot also wasn't progressing, I think it just stood out for me. But once we got past that 40% mark, I do think there was a lot more plot progression in here. This book is really a device to kind of connect those series together, so to connect From Blood and Ash and Flesh and Fire series together. So again, there was a lot of kind of, not so much info dumping, but it's really just a device to kind of connect those 2 books together. So again, the flow of the plot wasn't really as good as I would like it to be normally, but I do think that it was enjoyable by the end of it. I think that the threads were woven quite nicely there. I think it has really set up for the next book within the From Blood and Ash series as well. And I think the exploration of grief, there was a certain scene in here that the FMC was kind of exploring her grief and her trauma as she'd been trying to repress it, you know, throughout the whole book. And there was one certain scene in here that really touched me, and it really did impact me. So I think she did explore it really well. It was just the first 40% was a little bit repetitive of the FMC kind of repressing that grief and not wanting to explore it, and people asking her if she's okay and her saying yes, I'm fine, you know, and trying to distract herself from that. But yeah, overall I ended up on 4 stars for this one. I do think that this is one where I love the characters and I love the world. With JLA's writing, I do think that a lot of it can usually be trimmed down, but if you're invested in the characters and you're invested in the world, you probably don't mind it so much. So that's definitely me. I don't mind it so much because I'm really invested in the characters. But with these series, if you're not invested in the characters, I don't think you'd enjoy it as much, because there is a lot of fluff in here that probably doesn't need to be there. But as I say, if you love the series and you love the characters, you don't mind it so much. So 4 stars for me. That may be subjective, but yeah, excited to see what the next book in the series holds. So the next one I read, and the last one this month, was Primetime Romance by Kate Robb. Now, I've read her book This Spells Love last year, so it was an arc, and this was an arc as well. I think by the time this video comes out, the book will probably be out. I think it's around the 5th of September that it comes out, but I got it as an arc earlier this year because I had read This Spells Love. So if you haven't read This Spells Love, I definitely recommend that. It's very witchy, friends to lovers vibes, and yeah, definitely read that one if you haven't read it yet. But Primetime Romance is basically about this girl who is obsessed with this show, and it's called Carson's Cove. So very reminiscent of Dawson's Creek. It's for any of us that like those kind of 2000s sitcoms. So One Tree Hill, Dawson's Creek, The OC, all of those kind of teenage dramas. It's very reminiscent of that. It's basically about a girl who has recently been divorced. She's, you know, a bit down on her luck, a bit down on her life, and she's not really enjoying anything at the moment. She ends up waking up within her favourite TV show, and the story kind of goes from there. And I think for me it was a good, enjoyable read. I think it was a really cute romance. I think if you do like contemporary romance, you probably will like this one. If you really like those type of shows, you might like this one as well. But for me, I do think that the setup of the story and them having to kind of go into this show did mean that I thought that the characters weren't that well developed. I don't think we had enough time with the characters to really be invested in them before they had to maybe take on different personas, and it just meant that I wasn't connecting with them the way that I would like to. But in terms of the romance, it was quite a slow burn. It was a bit of a will they, won't they. I don't want to give too much away because it is quite a short book, so a lot of the synopsis might give away the whole story, but it was definitely a very cute read. If you like any of those kind of sitcom teen dramas, I think you will like this. It is quite reminiscent of that time. But yeah, for me, I landed on around a 3.5 for this one. It was a cute read, but probably nothing that I'm going to reread anytime soon. But I would recommend This Spells Love over that one. I definitely really enjoyed that one, maybe a little bit more. It had a bit more practical magic vibes. If you've watched that movie or read that book, it definitely had those vibes. So I would definitely recommend that one, and especially around this time of year. So if you haven't picked that one up, definitely add it to your TBR for this spooky season because it's perfect for this time of year. And that's everything for this month. So I read around 10 books. I do think that I was in a little bit of a slump this month. Again, I think it was just a case of me trying to stick to my TBR and the TBR books just not being the vibe for me. So I was very much caught between what I wanted to read, and then obviously with some of the new releases and some of the arcs that I got this month as well, it just meant that my reading schedule was a little bit up in the air. I was just trying to read anything so that I didn't end up getting in a slump. But I think overall I ended up having a pretty good month. There was quite a few 5 stars in there, quite a few new favourites. I did do some of my rereads as well. So overall it was a really enjoyable month for reading. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if there's any of these books that you are anticipating in the next few months. I'd love to get any of your recommendations down in the comments below. If you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I'm posting 2 videos a week, and it'll be videos like this, so monthly wrap-ups, reading vlogs, book shopping, book hauls, all of those good bookish things. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!